Good evening, dear listener, and welcome back to Serene Slumber Tales. Tonight, the rain is falling softly against the window panes of old London town. If you pause for just a moment, you may almost hear it, a gentle, steady rhythm upon glass and cobblestone, washing the world clean and quiet. It gathers along the gutters and trickles into unseen channels, threading its way through narrow lanes and lamplit streets. Carriages roll more slowly in such weather. Footsteps become hushed. Even the great city itself seems to draw a long, measured breath. Let your breathing follow that rhythm now, slow and easy, in through the nose and out through the mouth. There is nowhere else you need to be. No unfinished task calls for you. No clock demands your attention. The day has loosened its hold. The night, patient and kind, has arrived to keep watch. Allow your thoughts to drift like the mist rising from the Thames, unhurried and light. If one thought lingers, simply notice it and let it float gently onward, carried by the quiet rain. Tonight, we step into a warm sitting room, lit by the golden glow of a small coal fire. The flames shift lazily, amber and soft, casting long, friendly shadows that stretch and fold across patterned wallpaper. A kettle hums faintly in the background, its lid trembling just enough to whisper of warmth to come. The hour is late, and the world outside is softened by mist. The street lamps along Baker Street shine like blurred halos through the damp air, their light diffused into gentle orbs. Inside, however, all is calm. In a modest yet comfortable set of rooms at Baker Street sit two familiar figures, the thoughtful consulting detective, Sherlock Holmes, and his loyal friend and chronicler, Dr. John Watson. Their chairs are drawn close to the hearth, angled just so, as though arranged by habit and quiet understanding. A Persian slipper hangs from the mantel, its purpose known only to those who dwell here. Papers lie in gentle disarray upon a small side table, not chaotic, but comfortably lived in. A violin rests nearby, silent for now, its strings catching the firelight. The air smells faintly of tobacco and rain-damp wool. There is the comforting scent of old books, leather bindings warmed by the hearth, and perhaps the faintest trace of bergamot from a recently poured cup of tea. Outside, a hansom cab passes with a softened clatter, wheels hissing over wet stone before fading into the distance. Take another slow breath. Holmes reclines with thoughtful ease, long fingers steepled beneath his chin. His sharp features are softened by the flicker of firelight, his keen eyes reflecting a quiet, inward contemplation. Dr. Watson, ever steady and observant, sits opposite with a notebook resting loosely upon his knee, though tonight he does not write. Instead, he listens to the rain, to the kettle, to the subtle cadence of his friend's silence. There is something deeply reassuring about this room. It is a place where puzzles are welcomed rather than feared, where questions are invitations, and where even the most perplexing mysteries are approached with calm curiosity. Nothing here is rushed. Every detail is examined with care, like a delicate teacup held up to the light. Tonight's mystery is not one of violence or danger, but of curiosity, of identity, of a question that drifts like the mist along the Thames. It begins, as so many gentle puzzles do, with a worried spouse, a curious disappearance, and a small detail easily overlooked, a letter perhaps, mislaid, a familiar habit subtly altered, a name spoken just a shade too carefully. Such mysteries are the quiet kind, the sort that unfold not with thunder, but with the soft turning of a page. Let your shoulders soften. Feel the warmth of the fire at your back. Imagine the gentle weight of a woolen blanket across your lap. Outside, the rain continues its patient whisper, tapping against glass in an unbroken lullaby. Each drop joins another and another, until the sound becomes a steady, soothing curtain between this cozy room and the wider world. Holmes reaches for his pipe, though he does not yet light it. Instead, he gazes into the fire as though the dancing flames themselves contain fragments of the answer. Watson shifts comfortably in his chair, his presence a quiet anchor in the room. There is companionship here, a wordless understanding that no puzzle is faced alone. You, too, are welcome in this circle of warmth. There is nothing sharp or startling in the hours ahead, only gentle inquiry, only the unfolding of small clues laid carefully one beside the other, like stepping stones across a calm stream. If your thoughts wander as we begin, that is perfectly all right. Let them wander. Let them drift between the sound of rain and the crackle of coal, in through the nose and out through the mouth. The city beyond these walls grows quieter still. Shopkeepers have long since closed their shutters. The last lamps are dimming in distant windows. Somewhere, a clock strikes the hour, its chime softened by fog. Even time itself seems to move more slowly on such a night. And so, dear listener, nestled in the golden hush of Baker Street, as the rain keeps its steady rhythm and the fire glows low and kind, we begin. The mystery waits patiently, and there is all the time in the world. It was on an evening much like this one that a visitor arrived at Baker Street. The rain had been falling since dusk, not in harsh torrents, but in a steady silver curtain that turned the lamplight outside into blurred halos. The cobblestones shimmered as though varnished, and passing figures appeared only as softened silhouettes behind the gauze of mist and drizzle. Within the familiar rooms at 221B, the fire burned low and steady. The kettle gave its occasional sigh. The quiet was companionable. Dr. John Watson would later recall how the knock upon the door was polite, almost hesitant. Not the sharp rap of urgency, nor the bold thud of indignation, but something in between. 3 measured taps, a pause, then one more, lighter still, as though the visitor questioned her own resolve. Mrs. Hudson, ever attentive, answered at once and ushered in a woman of composed bearing, though her eyes carried the unmistakable strain of recent worry. Her cloak was neatly fastened despite the damp, her gloves buttoned with care. A few droplets of rain clung to the hem of her skirt, catching the firelight like scattered pearls. Her name, she explained after removing her gloves with steady hands, was Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb. She spoke calmly, with the deliberate precision of someone accustomed to keeping her composure. Yet beneath her voice lay a tremor of confusion, not hysteria, not panic, but the quiet unease of a question that refuses to settle. Her husband, a respectable gentleman engaged in trade near the city, had not returned home the previous night. That in itself was unusual, but not entirely alarming. Business could delay a man. Weather could complicate plans. London, after all, was vast and unpredictable. What troubled her was where she had last seen him. Near the river. Near a narrow street known for its less reputable establishments. Near, of all places, a dim and shadowed opium den. Now, dear listener, there is no need for alarm. We will not step into anything harsh or frightening. Imagine instead only the suggestion of it. A narrow staircase with worn wooden steps, a dim lantern swaying gently in the damp air, the faint scent of unfamiliar spices drifting from an open doorway. Nothing more, only the outline of a place spoken of in whispers, softened by distance and uncertainty. Holmes listened without interruption, fingertips pressed together beneath his chin. His expression did not change as she spoke. The firelight flickered softly across his thoughtful features, illuminating the keen stillness in his eyes. He seemed not to react, but to absorb, each word settling into its proper place, like pieces of a quiet mosaic. Mrs. Whitcomb explained that she had glimpsed her husband at an upstairs window of a shabby riverside building. She had been in a passing cab when she looked up, perhaps by instinct more than intention, and there he was, framed by lamplight, pale against the dim interior beyond. He had appeared distressed, she thought, or startled, though from a distance, through rain-streaked glass, it was difficult to tell. Before she could call to the driver to stop, before she could step down and reach the door below, he had vanished from sight. The image lingered with her, the brief meeting of eyes, the sense of something unsaid. When she had entered the building and inquired within, she was told no such gentleman had been there. The proprietor had shrugged. The patrons had offered only vague denials. She had searched as best she could, though propriety limited how far she dared to go. And so, with dignity intact, but heart unsettled, she had come to Baker Street. As she finished her account, the room fell gently silent once more. The rain continued its patient tapping at the window. Somewhere in the distance, carriage wheels rolled through shallow puddles. Holmes rose slowly, the movement unhurried. He crossed to the window and stood looking out, though it was clear he saw more than the rain. Outside, droplets traced quiet patterns down the glass, each path crossing another, merging and separating in delicate lines. "My dear madam," he said at last, his voice low and composed, "it is often the smallest detail that resolves the largest uncertainty. You have done wisely to come." There was no dramatics in his tone, no flourish, only reassurance. Dr. Watson observed, as he so often did, that Holmes seemed neither excited nor alarmed, merely attentive, calm, certain that somewhere within the account lay a thread waiting to be drawn loose, a word chosen carefully, a glance remembered imperfectly, the angle of a window, the timing of a cab's passage. Holmes turned back from the window and asked a few gentle questions. At what hour had she seen her husband? Had he worn his usual coat? Had there been light in the room behind him, or only shadow? Each inquiry was delivered softly, like the turning of pages in a well-loved book. Mrs. Whitcomb answered as best she could, her breathing slowing as she spoke. There is comfort, after all, in being heard, in having one's confusion treated not as folly, but as a puzzle worthy of patience. Holmes nodded once, thoughtfully. "There is," he murmured, "a difference between disappearance and misdirection. We must first determine which we face." Watson, watching his friend, felt the familiar quiet confidence settle over the room. Whatever uncertainty lay along the riverbank, whatever misunderstanding had taken shape behind that rain-streaked window, it was now subject to observation and reason. And as you rest there now, perhaps you can imagine the comfort of that certainty, that even the strangest confusion may yield to patient thought, that shadows, when approached gently, often resolve into simple forms. The fire gives a soft crackle. The kettle sighs again. The rain continues its steady lullaby against the glass. Take another slow breath, in through the nose and out through the mouth. The mystery has begun, but there is no rush. Only quiet steps forward, one careful question at a time. The following evening found Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson walking along the damp embankment, their footsteps softened by mist. The great river moved beside them in slow, dark currents, reflecting blurred lantern light like drifting strands of gold scattered upon black silk. A barge passed somewhere in the distance, its low horn sounding more like a sigh than a call. Rain continued its gentle descent. It was not the sort of rain that drives one to seek shelter in haste. Rather, it seemed content to accompany them, a cool presence on hat brims and coat shoulders, settling lightly before slipping away. The air carried the faint scent of water and stone, of moss clinging to old walls, of the city breathing in its sleep. Holmes walked with hands loosely clasped behind his back, his stride unhurried, his gaze occasionally lifting toward the dim line of buildings that faced the river. Watson kept pace beside him, collar turned up against the damp, observing as he so often did the quiet intensity that accompanied his friend's silences. The building in question leaned slightly with age, its brick darkened by years of river fog. Time had pressed its hand upon the structure, softening edges and deepening cracks. A modest sign hung crookedly beside the door, its lettering faded but legible beneath the gaslight's glow. Nothing about it shouted danger. Rather, it seemed tired, forgotten, a place the city had quietly set aside. A narrow staircase could be glimpsed through the rain-streaked window, rising into shadow. Holmes paused before entering, tilting his head slightly as though listening, not to sound, but to atmosphere. It was a curious habit of his. He seemed to weigh not only what was present, but what was absent. The rhythm of movement within, the tone of stillness, the subtle balance of a place. Watson, watching him, felt again that peculiar reassurance, that even in uncertainty, Holmes perceived order. At last, without comment, Holmes reached for the door. Inside, the air was warm and thick, yet hushed. A handful of quiet figures reclined in shadowed corners. The room was dimly lit, not sinister but subdued, as though sound itself had been softened by the low ceiling and heavy curtains. No commotion, no raised voices, only stillness, the sort that feels suspended rather than oppressive. A lantern flickered gently near the far wall, casting slow-moving shadows that stretched and withdrew with each tremor of flame. Holmes's gaze travelled upward almost immediately toward the window Mrs. Whitcomb had described. It stood above and slightly to the left, its glass clouded by condensation, its frame worn pale at the edges by years of use. The proprietor approached them without haste, a narrow-faced man with steady eyes and a manner carefully balanced between courtesy and caution. He denied any knowledge of the missing husband. His tone was even, calmly measured, perhaps too measured. He did not fidget. He did not protest excessively. He simply answered. Watson felt the faint stirrings of unease, not fear, but curiosity sharpened. The denial had been smooth, almost rehearsed. Yet nothing in the room suggested immediate alarm. No one looked toward the staircase. No one shifted uncomfortably. Holmes, however, appeared almost relaxed. "I wonder," he said mildly, "whether we might take a brief look upstairs, purely to satisfy a domestic concern." The proprietor hesitated only a fraction of a second before inclining his head. "As you wish, sir." The staircase creaked softly beneath their steps, each board announcing their ascent in low complaint. The corridor above was narrow, the air cooler. A single lamp burned near the far end, its light insufficient to fully banish shadow. The room in question lay midway along the hall. A brief inspection revealed little at first glance. A small table positioned near the window, a plain wooden chair, a shelf with nothing upon it but a chipped teacup. The curtains were drawn back loosely. The sill bore the faint marks of age and weather. Nothing overturned, nothing broken. Watson crossed to the center of the room, glancing about with quiet diligence. If a man had stood here the previous evening, distressed enough to catch his wife's eye from the street below, there was no obvious trace of turmoil left behind. And yet Holmes had already knelt near the window. He leaned close, examining something nearly invisible along the wooden frame. His long fingers hovered just above the surface before gently brushing across it. A smear, a subtle discoloration upon the wood. Not dramatic, not bright, merely a suggestion that something or someone had brushed hurriedly past. The mark was faint, irregular, almost blending into the grain itself. Easy to overlook, easier still to dismiss. Holmes studied it without speaking, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "Watson," he said quietly, "observe the direction." Watson stepped closer. The smear angled slightly downward toward the outer edge of the sill, as though made by a hand gripping for balance, or perhaps by fabric catching briefly before slipping free. Holmes stood, dusting his fingers lightly as though concluding a minor experiment. "It is remarkable," he murmured, "how often truth lingers in quiet corners." There was no body, no struggle, no sign of violence beyond that faint mark. The chair had not been overturned. The table bore no scratches. The air held no trace of chaos. Only the suggestion that someone had moved swiftly. Holmes turned toward the window itself and peered down into the narrow street below. From this vantage, one could see the glistening cobblestones and the soft halo of lamplight pooling in shallow puddles. A short drop perhaps, not insignificant, but not insurmountable. Watson felt his curiosity deepen, though it carried no dread. Rather, it felt like standing before a locked garden gate, knowing that the key must exist somewhere nearby. "The absence of disturbance," Holmes said gently, "is itself a form of presence." The mystery deepened not with terror, but with questions. Why had Mr. Whitcomb appeared at that window? Had he entered willingly? Had he departed by the door, or by another means? And why, if he had left unharmed, had he not returned home? Holmes cast one last thoughtful glance around the room before stepping back into the corridor. "And so," he concluded softly, "we proceed not by assumption, but by invitation." Questions, he always believed, were invitations, not threats. As you listen now, let that idea settle comfortably within you, that not knowing is not the same as danger. It is simply a doorway waiting to be opened, a pause before understanding, a quiet space where patience may take root. Outside, the rain continues its steady rhythm. Inside, the faint mark upon the sill waits, unremarkable and nearly forgotten, except by one pair of watchful eyes. Take another slow breath. The night remains calm, and the door has only just begun to open. The next morning brought a curious development. The rain had thinned to a fine silver mist, clinging lightly to rooftops and drifting low along the river's edge. The city stirred awake with unhurried reluctance. Shopkeepers lifted their shutters. Early carts rattled softly over damp stones. A pale wash of light filtered through the clouds, turning the Thames into a muted ribbon of pewter. Near the same riverside district, A well-known beggar was observed at his usual post. He was a familiar sight to passers-by, seated upon a folded crate beside a worn stretch of wall, his cap placed carefully before him. His face appeared twisted in an unfortunate expression, one side drawn downward as though by some old injury. His clothing hung loosely and was appropriately frayed, though not in tatters. There was about him an air of quiet resignation, as though hardship had long ago settled into permanence. Those who crossed the street each day scarcely glanced twice. A coin might drop, a sympathetic nod might follow, and then life moved on. Holmes had noticed him before. "There," he murmured, standing with Watson across the street beneath the modest shelter of an awning. "You see how constancy breeds invisibility." Watson followed his gaze. "A poor fellow," he said gently. "I confess I have passed him without much thought." Holmes's eyes gleamed with mild interest rather than suspicion. "Precisely, my dear Watson." There was something about the man's posture, the way he held his shoulders not in collapse, but in subtle readiness, the alertness in his eyes when coins clinked into his cup. Not gratitude alone, but calculation, a swift assessment of each passerby, a mind at work behind the mask of misfortune. "Watson," Holmes said softly, "have you ever considered how easily the eye accepts what it expects to see?" Watson admitted he had not given the beggar much thought. Holmes smiled faintly. The human mind delights in pattern. Present it with what resembles hardship, and it supplies the rest. They watched for a few quiet moments longer. The beggar adjusted his cap. A woman paused, offered a coin, and moved on. The man's gratitude was appropriately murmured. Yet as she turned away, his gaze sharpened briefly, thoughtful, appraising. Holmes straightened. "Let us make his acquaintance." The detective crossed the street with casual politeness, Watson following. Holmes removed his gloves as though preparing for a cordial introduction, rather than a revelation. "Good morning," Holmes said easily, inclining his head. The damp air must make for an uncomfortable vigil. The beggar looked up. His twisted lip deepened the impression of deformity. His voice, when he spoke, was rough, yet measured. "One grows accustomed, sir." "Indeed," Holmes replied. "Adaptation is among humanity's most remarkable talents." The beggar's eyes flickered, just for an instant. Holmes continued lightly, asking a few inconsequential questions. How long he had kept this corner, whether business had improved with the rain. The man's answers were cautious, neither evasive nor forthcoming. And then, with astonishing swiftness yet no violence, Holmes leaned forward. From his pocket, he produced a small, neatly folded handkerchief, dampened slightly from the morning mist. Before the beggar could recoil, Holmes brushed it firmly across the man's cheek. The twisted lip shifted. The dark discoloration beneath one eye smeared. The expression changed. Watson inhaled sharply. Where moments before had sat a deformed figure worn by hardship, there now emerged the unmistakable features of a clean-shaven gentleman. The distortion dissolved into symmetry. The sallow tint gave way to natural complexion. Before them sat not a pitiable vagrant, but a man in careful disguise. The beggar closed his eyes briefly and exhaled. Watson blinked in stunned silence. The man sighed, not in anger nor defiance, but in weary resignation. "It seems," he said quietly, his voice smoothing into its natural cadence, "that concealment is a fragile art. It was Mr. Whitcomb, alive, unharmed, and very much embarrassed, You may feel your own mind gently turning this over now, but there is no urgency. Let the realization unfold slowly, like the easing of rain clouds to reveal a pale sky beyond. Holmes did not scold. He did not accuse. He merely regarded the man with steady, attentive eyes. "Your wife," Holmes said gently, "was most concerned." At this, Mr. Whitcomb's composure faltered more than it had beneath exposure. He looked away toward the river. Financial pressures, he confessed quietly, had tightened around him in recent months. Trade had faltered. Investments had disappointed. Pride had prevented him from admitting the strain, especially to the wife who believed him steady and capable. One afternoon, in a moment of uncharacteristic desperation, he had observed the generous alms given to those less fortunate. An idea had taken root, at first absurd, then persistent. Disguised as a beggar, he had discovered to his astonishment that he earned more in a day of pity than in a week of honest trade. Ashamed, he had concealed this from his wife. Each morning he left home respectably dressed. Each afternoon he transformed within a rented upstairs room near the river. There he applied pigments and prosthetics, altering his appearance with surprising skill. By evening, he resumed his proper attire and returned home, his secret intact. On the night Mrs. Whitcomb glimpsed him at the window, he had been midway through this transformation. When he saw her carriage below, recognition flashed between them. Panic followed. Fearing exposure, fearing the collapse of dignity he had fought so hard to maintain, he had retreated abruptly from the window. In his haste to reapply disguise and depart unseen, he had refused all inquiries, allowing confusion to bloom where truth would have sufficed. Holmes listened without judgment. There was, Whitcomb added quietly, no harm intended, only concealment. No crime of violence, Holmes agreed softly. No sinister plot, only pride, desperation, and secrecy. Watson felt his earlier unease dissolve, replaced by a gentler understanding. How often, he reflected, do our fears inflate shadows into spectres? Holmes's voice remained calm, almost kind. The truth, he said, is often less monstrous than our imagination. Mr. Whitcomb nodded slowly. Arrangements were made with quiet discretion. The rented room would be relinquished, the disguises discarded. A conversation, long postponed, would take place at home. Watson later reflected that the case, though peculiar, ended not in tragedy but reconciliation. Mrs. Whitcomb, once the truth was revealed, was relieved beyond measure that her husband lived. Her distress had never been about reputation or deception, only about loss. The rest, they would mend together. And so the river flowed on, indifferent yet constant. The mist lifted. The city resumed its rhythm. What had seemed a dark mystery by lamplight resolved into something human, fragile, and forgivable. As you rest now, consider how gently misunderstanding can be untangled. How often what we fear most proves to be far less terrible than imagined. Take a slow breath. The morning has brightened, and all is well. Later that night, back at Baker Street, the fire burned low. The earlier brightness of the flames had settled into a bed of glowing embers, deep orange at their core, breathing softly beneath a lacework of ash. Every so often, a small coal shifted inward with a delicate sigh, sending up a brief shimmer of sparks before returning to stillness. The room felt wrapped in a gentle hush. Not silence, but a living quiet. The rain had softened to a mist. Where once droplets had tapped steadily at the panes, There was now only a fine veil drifting past the glass, blurring the lamplight beyond into pale halos. The city seemed content, untroubled, as though London itself had exhaled after the day's small drama. Holmes sat once more in his armchair, long fingers steepled beneath his chin. His posture was familiar, composed, yet looser now, the keen edge of investigation replaced by thoughtful repose. Across from him, Dr. John Watson bent over his notebook, recording the events with steady script. The scratch of pen upon paper was soft and rhythmic, blending with the faint crackle of coals. Watson paused now and then, considering his phrasing. He suspected that readers might find the tale more curious than thrilling. There had been no chase across rooftops, no perilous confrontation, no dramatic revelation beneath flashing lightning. Yet perhaps that is the charm. Not all mysteries roar like thunder. Some drift quietly through the evening, asking only to be understood. Some unsettle not with danger, but with uncertainty, and resolve not with triumph, but with clarity. Holmes shifted slightly, his gaze resting upon the fading embers. "My dear Watson," he said thoughtfully, "we are creatures of perception. We see what we expect until observation invites us to see anew." Watson smiled faintly, setting down his pen. And in this instance, expectation nearly obscured the simplest explanation. "Indeed," Holmes replied. "The disguise was effective not because it was flawless, but because it aligned so neatly with assumption." The image lingered for a moment. The man with two faces, the respectable gentleman and the pitiable beggar, both real in their way, both born of circumstance, and neither monstrous. Outside, carriage wheels rolled faintly along wet stone, their sound distant and unhurried. Somewhere, a door closed gently. A clock chimed the hour, its tone softened by fog. Inside, all was steady. The Persian slipper still hung from the mantel. The violin rested untouched beside the chair. A teacup, long emptied, cooled upon the side table. Familiar objects returned to their quiet watch. As you rest now, imagine yourself seated in that warm room. The case resolved, the questions answered, the world orderly once more. There is something deeply comforting about resolution, about the feeling that loose threads have been gathered and gently tied. Even when the truth is humble, even when it reveals nothing more dramatic than human pride, it carries with it a soothing weight. Let your breathing grow slower. Inhale gently. Exhale completely. Feel the warmth of the fire against your back, the steadiness of the floor beneath your feet, the quiet companionship in the room. Two friends settled in reflective silence, content with the evening's work. The rain continues its patient lullaby against the glass. There are no urgent knocks at the door tonight, no shadows that demand attention, no hurried footsteps upon the stair. The city beyond these walls drifts towards sleep, and within, the lamplight casts a soft amber glow that seems to gather everything into calm. Holmes reaches at last for his violin, not to play a complex or stirring melody, but to draw from it a single, lingering note. It hums gently in the air, low and soothing, blending with the hush of mist beyond the window. The sound rises and falls like a breath, then fades. Watson leans back in his chair, eyes half-lidded in quiet contentment. In this room, puzzles are not threats. They are invitations. Confusion is not darkness. It is simply a veil waiting to be lifted. And when lifted, it often reveals something far less fearsome than imagined. As you listen, allow the images to soften now, the river fading into mist, the crooked sign by the embankment, the faint mark upon the windowsill. See them blur gently, as though viewed through rain-streaked glass. The lamplight dims. The fire settles into glowing coals. The pages of Watson's notebook close with a soft whisper. At serene slumber tales, our journeys always return to calm. No matter how winding the path, no matter how curious the question, we end where warmth resides. You are safe. You are warm. The world beyond may carry its mysteries, but tonight they rest. There is nothing you must solve, nothing you must untangle. Only the steady rhythm of your breathing and the quiet knowledge that understanding, like morning light, always finds its way. Inhale softly. Exhale slowly. Like the gentle rain over London town, sleep may come softly. And stay. Good night.